Hello everyone, today we talk about the famed Battle of Pharsalus, fought on August 9th, 48 BC in the plains of central Greece near the Enipeus river, marking a decisive confrontation in the Roman civil war between Gaius Julius Caesar and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. If you prefer Gaius Julius Caesar and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, this engagement, as you know, is a critical juncture in the dissolution of the Roman so-called Republic, which is a historiographical invention telling the truth. The Res Publica continued as far as the Romans were concerned, and they didn't think to be living in Republican times as we call them today. In any case, this engagement pitted Caesar's veteran legions. Here we will talk about the numbers here. Essentially, I used the lowest end, or at least what I thought in this sense to be the more pertinent figures calculation against Pompey's numerical superior force, almost double, supported by the Roman Senate and aristocratic factions. And we know how, say, the political background witnessed the rise of the escalation of political tensions exacerbated by the breakdown of the first triumvirate and Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BC, which had precipitated open warfare. And so Pharsalus represents the culmination of a series of maneuvers in this campaign across Greece where strategic and political stakes converged to determine the trajectory of Roman governance. You know how it ended. This is also a rather simple battle to memorize in its tactical development, and we will see better why today. In any case, its outcome would fundamentally alter the power dynamics of Rome, accelerating the transition from a more sort of oligarchic to essentially more monarchic rule already under Caesar's dominance. It's a process, it's a continuum. We will talk more and better about this because this is a tactical analysis for the battle series. We never really talked much about this phase in Roman history. I made a video about Caesar's dictatorship, which, as you know, was a specific magistracy in the Roman constitutional order. And we talked about Caesar in many other circumstances, especially a lot concerning the Gallic Wars. So I think this is the very first video about the Roman civil war between Caesar and Pompey. Now, the beauty of classical battles, as we have had the opportunity to already experience on Schwerpunkt, is that we rely on just a few sources, primary sources, for their interpretation. Therefore, this is fundamentally all we have, aside from some general speculation regarding aspects that, without a firmer explicitation, can never be fully known, nor they can be fully known in general, even when there is a source that tells us how things really were. On the other hand, because this often generates also an attitude from the side of say, of our culture, and saying, so we can't rely on the sources are always biased, this was all propaganda, or whatever. Normal historians do not say this. Of course, we know that everything could have been more or less molded, but the actual adherence to historical accuracy, plausibility, and even just the overall picture that we get about the warfare of the time and the specific context and all the details that we gather from it align, right, with a general pattern. There are some battle accounts, especially in different times in history, that may have departed from even that interest in being somehow accurate. And we know pretty well, like we have a traumatically advanced historical, philological understanding. So nobody has to tell us, well, but, this source is biased, so we should trash the whole bin. Absolutely not, right? Classical sources are strikingly reliable, and they tell us, just as in other eras, I mean, a medievalist is speaking here, specializing especially in battles of reconstruction. Naturally, the more they are, the better, right? Because you can see at that point the degree by which sources tend to not necessarily disagree with one another, but of course to highlight different aspects, giving us some information, withholding others at some point that we know from other sources, etc. I will not digress on, say, the philosophy and the method of historical interpretation, because my point was exactly that we can straightforwardly, as we have already done, especially for classical battles, read straight away from the sources that in this sense are much more interesting just for how they articulate the picture than for the battle reconstruction itself. So big spoiler, or at least something that, again, I presume all of you knows, this battle may seem banal from a tactical point of view, because fundamentally it revolves around a ruse, an ambush that Caesar, as you can see even just from the map, without the maneuvers taking place yet, set up this sort of trap of deploying infantry behind cavalry on his right wing that was attacked by the left wing of Pompey, commanded by Labienus, by the way, that had been, as you know, Caesar's a master of horses in Gaul. Eventually, during the civil war, he had switched to the side of Pompey, likely because he depended on the Pompeian clienteles in the Picenum in central Italy, where he was originally of. And to make the long story short, Caesar cavalry, inferior in number, is overwhelmed by Labienus, but this guy finds just behind Caesar cavalry Caesar's infantry, and as you know, at this point in the history of the art of war, infantry is the queen of battles. And so even though, as you can see here, Pompey has a striking advantage in cavalry, Labienus' mounted force is overwhelmed, and Caesar at this point simply proceeds to outflank Pompey with just the small infantry contingent, and or, again, what we can imagine may have also participated alongside it during the battle, that being a relatively symmetrical clash between two Roman forces of, again, uneven size and quality, whatever, however, still functioned in, and this is the most important part, say, of also the overall lesson, not much from the battle, but from also the general art of war. Once you had flanked the enemy in that circumstance, the enemy line collapses, right? You could extend this. Remember when all the experts say, I tell you how the Macedonian, the pseudo experts, self-citizens experts tell how the Macedonian phalanx worked, like in the moment in which it was outflanked, it broke. Well, because here, what are we seeing, right? We're seeing the same identical thing. People think that, I don't know, different armies follow, especially, I don't know, in ancient history, when the differences were negligible in terms, in this case, of heavy infantry, for example, some such highly differentiated patterns of dynamics. It's just a basic strategic principle. So this is all what the battle is, all right? In a brief summary, this is what most YouTube channels would stop to. But as we said, by reading these sources, including the Commentari de Bello Civili by Kaiser Caesar himself, will probably stick to the English, in turn deriving mostly from the ecclesiastical pronunciation for the battle. I love the so-called restituta, but and classical pronunciation thus. But we also have to not to overly emphasize something that, for the sake of communication, is not necessary in the moment. So this is the commentaries on the Civil War, Book 3, chapters 84 to 98. This is actually a pretty long text, and we will include some sort of whereabouts of the battle. Here we've just reconstructed from a tactical point of view, but really not losing this, of course, this splendid opportunity to read from Caesar. That was not just one of the greatest heroes in the Res Publica Populi Romani, and an entire metaphysics had been created. Also, oddly following, or unsurprisingly following, we would say, the Clausewitzian Trinity with the theology of Fortuna Caesaris. but also one of the greatest writers in the history of mankind, and one that really provides, especially for this type of work, if we're not here digressing too much on the literary history of it. If anything, we'll make other videos. An effectively straightforward narrative, right? That was needed for political propaganda. For that does not mean absolutely that this is a militarily, incorrect or subjective or fantasy-like. Actually, it aligns dramatically with strategic notions that Caesar himself beautifully expresses, and that were the textbook literally for many of our ancestors ever since. So I will simply read. This may take a while. We'll stop, of course, whenever something specifically tactical needs to be discussed in some way. Regarding the size of the armies, before I start, here, as I was saying before, I stuck to the figures you see, which I think are more or less, they align effectively with Caesar's narration. There is some historiographical debate about this, but we can't enter much in it, also because it doesn't add too much regarding the tactical analysis that we're carrying out. Then if at some point, because I've been doing this now, we can expand on different sides of the battle, I will make different videos on, also based on curiosity, whatever you may want to ask. I've started doing it recently, the episode, for example, about the deployment of the armies at Bouvines. So these tactical analyses are long, pretty long by themselves already. Whatever I can add in the moment to explain better, of course, is already an important addition to an otherwise more straightforward reconstruction. Because always remember, as von Clausewitz says, war is actually simple, right? It's not that difficult to understand. It's difficult to wage, but especially in the bigger engagement, the strategic essentials are the same. So here, corn being provided and his soldiers refreshed, that Caesar writes in third person, in a sufficient time having elapsed since the engagement at Dyrrhachium, because as you know, this is following Caesar's defeat, a quasi-defeat, complete defeat at the end of Pompey in Epirus. When Caesar, I'm continuing to read, thought he had sufficiently sounded the dispositions of his troops, he thought that he ought to try whether Pompey had any intention or inclination to come to battle. Accordingly, he led his troops out of the camp and ranged them in order of battle at first on their own ground and at a small distance from Pompey's camp. But afterward, for several days in succession, he advanced from his camp and led them to the hills on which Pompey's troops were posted, which conduct inspired his army every day with fresh courage. However, he adhered to his former purpose respecting his cavalry, for as he was by many degrees inferior in number, he selected the youngest and most active of the advanced guard and desired them to fight intermixed with the horse, and they by constant practice acquired experience in this kind of battle. By these means it was brought to pass that 1,000 of his horse would dare, even on open ground, to stand against the 7,000 of Pompey. So here I reduce, of course, Caesar's figures according to the minimum that we think that Pompey may have feel, at least on the basis of what the sources explicitly say. This is already a very big army, all right, from both sides after the Dyrrhachium's defeat, especially from Caesar's side. So everything adds up in a general sense. Here I reduced a bit number to, generally speaking, presume that the, major engagements are more balanced in odds, right? But we also may, I didn't put a range here. I stuck sort of to the lower end. But again, this doesn't change too much the dynamic at all right? So at 7,000 of Pompey's, if occasionally required, and would not be much terrified by their number. For even on one of those days, he was successful in a cavalry action and killed one of the two Allobrogians who had deserted to Pompey, as before observed, and several others. This is very interesting because, again, it's not just a big clash, it's also these skirmishes in front of the field. There are between horsemen, by the way, and Gauls here that the Saint Caesar had brought from his Gallic expeditions, and that were in any case being used by the Romans as auxiliaries. Here they had defected to Pompey, and they had an important equestrian culture, as we have documented in other videos. But here, of course, the Romans also have the upper hand. I'm not going to digress on the story that the Roman Gallic cavalry comparison is misunderstood. I already made videos on this. And yeah, essentially the Romans had actually better cavalry than the Gauls in qualitative terms. In any case, Pompey, because he was encamped on a hill, drew up his army at the very foot of it, ever in expectation, as may be conjectured, that Caesar would expose himself to his disadvantageous situation. Caesar, seeing no likelihood of being able to bring Pompey to an action, judged it the most expedient method of conducting the war to decamp from that post, and to be always in motion, with this hope that by shifting his camp and removing from place to place, he might be more conveniently supplied with corn, and also that being in motion he might get some opportunity of forcing them to battle, and might be constant marches harass Pompey's army, which was not accustomed to fatigue. These matters being settled, when the signal for marching was given and the tents struck, it was observed that shortly before, contrary to his daily practice, Pompey's army had advanced further than usual from his entrenchment, so that it appeared possible to come to an action on equal ground. Then Caesar addressed himself to his soldiers when they were at the gates of the camp ready to march out. "We must defer," says he, "our march at the present, and set our thoughts on battle, which has been our constant wish. Let us then meet the foe with resolute souls. We shall not hereafter easily find such an opportunity." He immediately marched out at the head of his troops. Pompey also, as was afterward known, at the unanimous solicitation of his friends, had determined to try the fate of a battle, for he had even declared in a council a few days before that before the battalions came to battle, Caesar's army would be put to the rout. When most people expressed their surprise at it, "I know," says he, "that I promise a thing almost incredible, but hear the plan on which I proceed, that you may march to battle with more confidence and resolution. I have persuaded our cavalry, and they have engaged to execute it as soon as the two armies have met, to attack Caesar's right wing on the flank, and enclosing their army in the rear, throw them into disorder and put them to the rout before we shall throw a weapon against the enemy. By this means we shall put an end to the war without endangering the legions, and almost without a blow. Nor is this a difficult matter, as we far outnumber them in cavalry." At the same time, he gave them notice to be ready for battle on the day following, and since the opportunity which they had so often wished for was now arrived, not to disappoint the opinion generally entertained on their experience and valor. This is interesting, by the way, because you already see Pompey's main tactic outlined, simply outflanking Caesar's army with cavalry, given the crushing superiority in this arm, and simply making it. So not much of a different thing than what Caesar would actually do with Pompey's force, cavalry aside. The outflanking, all right, that is the key. It would have sufficed likely to take out Caesar's forces had this maneuver succeeded. After him, Labienus spoke, as well to express his contempt of Caesar's forces as to extol Pompey's scheme with the highest encomiums. "Think not, Pompey," says he, "that this is the army which conquered Gaul and Germany. I was present at all those battles, and do not speak at random on a subject of which I am a stranger. A very small part of that army now remains. Great numbers lost their lives, as must necessarily happen in so many battles. Many fell victims to the autumnal pestilence in Italy. Many returned home, and many were left behind on the continent. Have you not heard that the cohorts at Brundusium are composed of invalids? The forces which you now behold have been recruited by levies lately made in Hither Spain, and the greater part from the colonies beyond the Po. Moreover, the flower of the forces perished in the two engagements at the Iracian. Having so said, he took an oath never to return to his camp unless victorious." Yeah, so this is a devotio, basically, and he encouraged the rest to do the like. Pompey applauded his proposal and took the same oath. Nor did any person present hesitate to take it. After this had passed in the council, they broke up full hopes and joy, and in imagination anticipated victory, because they thought that in a matter of such importance no groundless assertion could be made by a general of such experience. When Caesar had approached near Pompey's camp, he observed that his army was drawn up in the following manner. On the left wing were the 2 legions delivered over by Caesar at the beginning of the disputes in compliance with the Senate's decree, one of which was called the first, the other the third. Here Pompey commanded in person. Scipio with the Syrian legions commanded the center. The Cilician legion, in conjunction with the Spanish cohorts, which we said were brought over by Afranius, were disposed on the right wing. This Pompey considered his steadiest troops. The rest he had interspersed between the center and the wing, and he had 110 complete cohorts. This amounted to 45,000 men. He had, so again here I shorten again a little bit the numbers. He had besides 2 cohorts of volunteers who, having received favors from him in former wars, flocked to his standard. And these were dispersed through his whole army. The 7 remaining cohorts he had disposed to protect his camp and the neighboring forts. His right wing was secured by a river with steep banks, for which reason he placed all his cavalry, archers, and slingers on his left wing. All right. Caesar, observing his former custom, had placed the 10th legion on the right, the 9th on the left, although it was very much weakened by the battles at Dyrrhachium. He placed the 8th legion so close to the 9th as to almost make one of the 2, and ordered them to support one another. He drew up on the field 80 cohorts, making a total of 22,000 men. He left 2 cohorts to guard the camp. He gave the command of the left wing to Antonius, of the right to Sulla, and of the center to Domitius. He himself took his post opposite Pompey, at the same time fearing from the disposition of the enemy which we have previously mentioned, lest his right wing might be surrounded by their numerous cavalry. He rapidly drafted a single cohort from each of the legions, composing the 3rd line, formed of them a 4th line, and opposed them to Pompey's cavalry, and acquainting them with his wishes, admonished them the success of that day depended on their courage. At the same time, he ordered the 3rd line and the entire army not to change without his command, that he would give the signal whenever he wished them to do so. The depth of the infantry is interesting because it was just, as you know, there is no such thing like a standard Roman deployment or any other army's deployment in general. As far as the strategic purpose of this, it was evidently to extend the fray between the infantrymen, right? And so something that it's sort of underrated in general about the battle, because we presume, oh, it's just this action that is happening on the right wing of Caesar, right? With the cavalry of Labienus and the ambush set up by the Caesar's legionnaires. But this is all still resting. Like, this is a bit like a hammer and anvil, yes, but the anvil has to be pretty strong. Like, you can't risk your own infantry lines to break during the fight as well, because, you know, especially if it is a single line, which is something that the Romans learned from the Battle of the Allia River, or at least different times in the art of war. I made a video about that. You're done for, right? So having an in-depth formation, also from Pompey, as we've seen, is important, especially against Caesar's veterans that definitely were fierce to encounter in open ground, face to face. I would say enough is an obvious tactic. Also considering that we're looking at the same Roman army, like fighting against each other, right? So when Caesar was exhorting his army to battle, according to the military custom, of course I'm reading, and spoke to them of the favors that they had constantly received from him, he took special care to remind them that he could call his soldiers to witness the earnestness with which he had sought peace, the efforts that he had made by Vatinius to gain a conference with Labienus, and likewise by Claudius to treat with Scipio in what manner he had exerted himself at Oricum to gain permission from Libo to send ambassadors, that he had been always reluctant to shed blood of his soldiers, and that did not wish to deprive the Republic of one or other in her armies. After delivering this speech, he gave by a trumpet the signal to his soldiers, who were eagerly demanding it, and were very impatient from the onset. There was in Caesar's army a volunteer of the name of Crastinus, who the year before had been first centurion of the 10th Legion, a man of preeminent bravery. He, when the signal was given, says, "Follow me, my old comrades, and display such exertions in behalf of your general as you have determined to do. This is our last battle, and when it shall be won, he will recover his dignity and we our liberty." At the same time, he looked back to Caesar and said, "General, I will act in such a manner today that you will feel grateful to me, living or dead." After uttering these words, he charged first into the right wing, and about 120 chosen volunteers of the same century followed. Now, the importance to centurions is crucial in Caesar's work. This is a popularis move. The centurions had historically not been permanently recognized in the cadres of a professional Roman army. At least the Marian reforms had been accelerating this process, but it's only under Caesar that centurions start receiving like a very recognized sort of cornerstone function by, obviously enough, promoting the worthy man already provided with past military experience in such a way that would head towards, again, a more professional cadre outlook that would be fully consolidated only by the time of Augustus. It's not like it was a mess before. Centurions were not recognized at every legion that was levied. They had to remake. No, it's a bit of an extreme meme that is used to explain eventually what happened later. But it's primarily a political move, right? And here we're talking about the primipilos, the centurion first spear of the 10th Legion, by the way. So Caesar's favorite. And so we're talking about men that I never really made a video about centurions, but at some point we'll have really to show what kind of what kind of mold we're made of. In any case, you also probably know what happens to Crastinus during the Battle of Pharsalus. There was so much space left between the two lines as sufficed for the onset of the hostile armies, but Pompey had ordered his soldiers to await Caesar's attack and not to advance from their position or suffer their line to be put into disorder. This is a very important indication of the fact that, at least here in Caesar's view, and this aligns, in fact, with the quality of the legions that were deployed, that Pompey could afford the advantage of, let's say, of position, right? At least he would not expose his men more than necessary, and advancing more would have indeed disordered more the formation. It was thus Caesar's time to advance, rather, having also men of superior discipline and experience that could thus remain more aligned, but still surely losing some of that order in the process. By the way, in a general strategical sense, as we've seen, Caesar lured Pompey out, not because Pompey, could have not enjoyed a more defensive position. The point is, how much are you spending by keeping all those legionnaires in arms, right? There is all a strategic political background, and mostly that we should address when looking at Caesar and Pompey's civil war. Again, we've never done that. This is not the time to discuss it. So you can't keep an army forever on the field, on campaign. There's a pressure, especially with such big numbers, in any case, even if you're so plenty of money like Pompey was, and having this nominal superiority over Caesar, especially in numbers, fighting, again, the same legionnaires, but being aware, of course, he was facing one of the greatest commanders in Roman history, and some of the best soldiers available to him. What Labienus said, as you heard in the speech, was a way to sort of belittle Caesar's forces. They were reduced in as much as, again, they had been beaten by Pompey. All what he listed was actually true, and it is actually much to Caesar's credit that he would write it himself in his own account, giving voice to this enemy, to this traitor of his in hindsight, to some extent. But that's also a complicated notion we'll look again at in another video. However, again, everything aligns in the behavior of this fundamentally oddly balanced forces, right? As most, again, bigger engagements really are. So let's not think that there was some overarching dynamic whereby what these two leaders did was fundamentally wrong. Even as we've seen, Pompey's general attitude was fairly cautious. But the fundamentals were also Pompey had important command experience. He was called Magnus for his victories. Naturally, there is all the background to that and various vicissitudes that would maybe overrate his military experience, but not quite in general. I mean, he had really done a lot for Rome also in the East, reorganizing Syria after the end of the Seleucids, etc. So he was not like the guy who said, I am so big, and he was not competent. Pompey was competent. The idea of outflanking Caesar's forces with superior cavalry was kind of obvious. But also this caution in deploying troops in depth, because he knew that Caesar's veterans had to be worn out. He couldn't risk everything on a single line of sort of lesser quality troops, regardless of numerical superiority. Did make sense, right? So you can't blame Pompey for not having had much of a genius in this battle. But again, would have you done better? Would have you been capable of organizing a battle, for planning for a clash like this? In any case, continuing, Caesar, he's said to have done this by the advice of this is talking about Pompey, actually, of Caius Triarius, that the impetuosity of the charge of Caesar's soldiers might be checked and their line broken, and that Pompey's troops remaining in the ranks might attack them while in disorder, and he thought that the javelins would fall with less force if the soldiers were kept in their ground than if they met in their course. At the same time, he trusted that Caesar's soldiers, after running over double the usual ground, would become weary and exhausted by fatigue. But to me, Pompey seems to have acted without sufficient reason, for there is a certain impetuosity of spirit and an alacrity implanted by nature in the hearts of all men, which is inflamed by a desire to meet the foe. This a general should endeavor not to repress, but to increase. Nor was it a vain institution of our ancestors that his trumpets should sound on all sides, and a general shout be raised, by which they imagined that the enemy were struck with terror, and their own army inspired with courage. This is an incredibly beautiful thing. I will post the Latin somewhere, because this speaks volumes about the aforementioned aggressivity of the Roman legionnaires, their actual smashing capacity in charges, etc. That's mostly a meme for, I don't know, the barbarians. But look at what actually the very disciplined Marian soldiers were able to do at this point. Is a beautiful, I can read in Latin, quod nobis quidem nulla ratione factum, a Pompeio videtur, propterea quod est quaedam animi incitatio, atque alacritas naturaliter innata omnibus, quae studio pugnae incenditur, anc non reprimere, sed augere imperatores debent. This is such an important, the way it's written here. It's so theologically important. Augere is the the same etymology of Augustus, to increase, right, in a divine sense. So the idea of stimulating the fire in the hearts of the soldiers before the battle must be augmented by the imperatores, is the term here. So obviously those who detain the imperium as leaders, right? We should always read in Latin, telling the truth. Neque frustra antiquitus institutum est, ut signa undique concinerent, clamoremque universi tolerant, quibus rebus, et oste terri, et suos incitari extimaverunt. This is incredibly beautiful, unspeakably beautiful, right? This is pure Indo-Europeanness in the most exciting ways. So going back to the following, say, but our men, when the signals was given, rushed forward with their javelins ready to be launched. Remember the use of the pilum in the assault, in the charge, but perceiving that Pompey's men did not run to meet their charge, having acquired experience by custom and being practiced in former battles, they of their own accord repressed their speed. All right. So as we've seen, the guy, the Triarius, which is also like a meme for saying the guy who really acts last in defense, right? In that sense, say let these hotheads, these aggressive, bloodthirsty Caesarian legionnaires, like simply rush to the attack and arrive to the Pompeian lines broken. And Caesar says, basically without any command of mine, these guys understood that since the Pompeians were not actually coming to meet them, as we have just said here, as the ancients, I mean the older Romans did by essentially charging against one another, etc. So given to the Pompeian soldiers that some cowardice, right, and lack of impetus that was definitely needed to crush the enemy lines during a charge. The same Caesarian legionnaires that thought that by the way the Pompeians would have behaved like that refrained from making that frenetically disciplined step rush, calibrating, as you know, how the actual pila were thrown at volleys at different distances depending on how close they had come to enemy lines. They understand by themselves, because they are experienced, because they are veterans, that they have to slow down, because it would be of no use to run at that point and breaking the lines, becoming more fatigued, etc. So the Roman legionary gear is pretty heavy to begin with. So, but perceiving that Pompey's men did not run to meet their charge, having acquired experience by custom and being practiced in former battles, they of their own accord repressed their speed and halted almost midway, which was not even that a short distance. So it's interesting, as if, you know, collectively they were already programmed to do this on a sort of some distance, but they understood that this was not quite the thing. It's as if they had already been programmed to be that aggressive, to be that assaulting, charging, and this speaks volumes about the Roman military, really. That they might not come up with the enemy when their strength was exhausted, and after a short respite they again renewed their course and threw their javelins and instantly drew their swords, as Caesar had ordered them. Nor did Pompey's men fail in this crisis, for they received our javelins, stood our charge, and maintained their ranks. All right. And having launched their javelins, had recourse to their swords. At the same time, Pompey's horse, according to their orders, rushed out at once from his left wing, and his whole host of archers poured after them. Our cavalry did not withstand their charge, but gave ground a little, upon which Pompey's horse pressed them more vigorously, and began to file off in troops and flank our army. All right. When Caesar perceived this, he gave the signal to his fourth line, which he had formed of the 6 cohorts. They instantly rushed forward and charged Pompey's horse with such fury that not a man of them stood. But all wheeling about, not only quitted their post, but galloped forward to seek a refuge in the highest mountains. By their retreat, the archers and slingers, being left destitute and defenseless, were all cut to pieces. The cohorts, pursuing their success, wheeled about upon Pompey's left wing, while his infantry would still continue to make battle and attack them in the rear. So you understand, this is just a paragraph, the 93. right? 93 is, call it chapter of book 3, right? It's so straightforward. This is so relevant about also the narratives of the same people, like in this case, that commanded the battle themselves, right? It's as straightforward as we just basically summarized at the beginning. It's interesting to point out that especially infantry charged cavalry, right? Remember, Caesar told these guys, look, everything depends on your courage. So here it's mostly a matter of, cavalry in antiquity was not as smashing as the medieval sort of feudal one, but it still did smash the hell out of lots of enemies. Yes, infantry was superior, but here we have properly Roman legionaries charging against Roman cavalry, which is really impressive. And this may have been probably the highlight of Caesar. Like look at what this guy actually were able to do. Like, I gave them this order, they literally charge into the enemy cavalry. It's not like he told them to, but they would. This is very much yet another Roman theological principle, the one of redemption, one of giving a chance to the lower for, in fact, augmenting themselves, right? So this is incredibly important. As much as the fact, by the way, there's the archers and his lingers were also cut to pieces by whom. Of course, there was some cavalry left, but we have really to think that bigger formations are easier to reach also by heavier troops, and so that the same heavy legionnaires would have massacred these harassers, so to say. Then going on, at the same time, Caesar ordered his third line to advance, which till then had not been engaged. So we're told that different lines were engaged at different times. Naturally, the first would have engaged in the sense before the second, but really with space times, which makes a lot of sense, generally speaking. Like, as far as we know about Roman warfare, we will resume some videos about Roman tactics. Here, it's the last reserve, right? So the last line, the gradual release of energies of force, had they kept their posts. Thus, new and fresh troops having come to the assistance of the fatigue and others having made an attack on the rear, Pompey's men were not able to maintain their ground, but all fled, nor was Caesar deceived in his opinion that the victory, as he had declared in his speech to his soldiers, must have its beginning from those 6 cohorts, which he had placed as a fourth line to oppose the horse. It's interesting that he timed the entrance of the third line, so just by with the one of the outflanking maneuver on the right. So it's like, I don't know, the second line was still fighting when this happened, and literally waited until the outflanking happened in order to pull them out of that. All right. Says for them, the fourth lines of those cohorts, remember, had been also concentrated towards the cavalry on the right. But the cavalry were routed. By them, the archers and slingers were cut to pieces. So literally, we're confirmed that it was those heavy legionaries who did that. By them, the left wing of Pompey's army was surrounded and obliged to be the first to flee. Here, by the wing, we're talking the legionary one. But when Pompey saw his cavalry routed and that part of his army on which he reposed his greatest hopes thrown into confusion, despairing of the rest, he quitted the field and retreated straight away on horseback to his camp, and calling to the centurions whom he had placed to guard the Praetorian gate with a loud voice that the soldiers might hear, "Secure the camp," says he, "defend it with diligence if any danger should threaten it. I will visit the other gates and encourage the guards of the camp." Having thus said, he retired into his tent in utter despair, yet anxiously waiting the issue. Like, the sheer psychological collapse, proving once again that, the commanders have everything on their shoulders. And so here, practically, the battle is not over, but let's say, at least from the picture here, like, that documents the open field, it's another thing. Caesar having forced the Pompeians to flee into their entrenchment. So, of course, the big battle is over, right? So there are these actions by the camps that at some point were important in other battles. We've seen them at Magnesia, for example, in that sort of melange that they made of all the Manipular Legion versus Macedonian Phalanx kind of thing. But and so there is still something about them. It says, thinking that he ought not to allow them any respite to recover from their fright, exhorted his soldiers to take advantage of Fortune's kindness and to attack the camp. The Fortuna Caesaris, right? So he had risked so much, and now his reward has arrived. Though they were fatigued by the intense heat, for the battle had continued till midday, yet being prepared to undergo any labor, they cheerfully obeyed his command. The camp was bravely defended by the cohorts which had been left to guard it, but with much more spirit by the Thracians and foreign auxiliaries. For the soldiers who had fled for refuge to it from the field of battle, affrighted and exhausted by fatigue, having thrown away their arms and military standards, and their thoughts more engaged on their further escape than on the defense of the camp. Nor could the troops who were posted on the battlements long withstand the immense number of our darts, but fainting under their wounds, quitted the place, and under the conduct of their centurions and tribunes fled without stopping to the high mountains which joined the camp. In Pompey's camp you might see harbors in which tables were laid, a large quantity of plates set out, the floors of the tents covered with fresh sods, the tents of Lucius Lentulus and others shaded with ivy, and many other, even with the things which were proofs of excessive luxury and confidence of victory. So, okay, this is not military anymore, but it still gives an idea of the morale. Like, what did the Pompeians think, right? They felt so secure, but mostly by their wealth, right? That was a choice that Pompey had made. The East was the wealthiest and the least military manned, right? So he had done so to content all the senators that escaped with him, right, to sustain them in the moment. So again, here we can't continue reading, of course, so that it might readily be inferred that they had no apprehensions of the issue of the day, as they indulged themselves in unnecessary pleasures, and yet upbraided with luxury Caesar's army, distressed and suffering troops who had always been in want of common necessaries. Of course, there is a contrast between the spiritual side of Caesar and these guys who had indulged in some sort of Hellenistic luxury. Pompey, as soon as our men had forced the trenches, mounting his horse and stripping off his general's habit, went hastily out of the back gate of the camp and galloped with all speed to Larissa. Nor did he stop, we are in Thessaly, right? But with the same dispatch, collecting a few of his flying troops and halting neither day nor night, he arrived at the seaside attended by only 30 horse, and went on board on a victualling bark, often complaining, as we have been told, that he had been so deceived in his expectation that he was almost persuaded that he had been betrayed by those from whom he had expected victory, as they began the fight. This is very interesting from a psychological point of view, because, as you know, Caesar does not... I mean, he actually respects Pompey to the extent he at least analyzes his impression. Like the fact he had made a mistake, and that's blaming on the others, of course, is not a very Roman thing, especially as an imperator. But at least he understands the kind of feeling, the kind of emotion was going through him. It's very, very beautiful. Caesar was actually an incredibly sensitive person. Caesar, having possessed himself of Pompey's camp, urged his soldiers not to be too intent on plunder and lose the opportunity of completing their conquest. Having obtained their consent, he began to draw lines around the mountain. The Pompeians, distrusting the position, as there was no water on the mountain, abandoned it, and all began to retreat towards Larissa, which Caesar, perceiving, divided his troops. In ordering part of his legions to remain in Pompey's camp, sent back a part of his own camp, and taking 4 legions with him, went by a shorter road to intercept the enemy, and having marched 6 miles, drew up his army. But the Pompeians, observing this, took post on a mountain whose foot was washed by a river. Caesar, having encouraged his troops, though they were greatly exhausted by incessant labor the whole day, and night was now approaching, by throwing up works cut off the communication between the river and the mountain, that the enemy might not get water in the night. As soon as the work was finished, they sent ambassadors to treat about a capitulation. A few senators who had espoused that party made their escape by night, And so here, just to complete the 98th chapter, at break of day, Caesar ordered all those who had taken post on the mountain to come down from the higher grounds into the plain and pile their arms. When they did this without refusal, with outstretched arms prostrating themselves on the ground, with tears implored his mercy. He comforted them and bade them rise, and having spoken a few words of his own clemency to alleviate their fears, he pardoned them all, and gave orders to his soldiers that no injury should be done to them and nothing taken from them. Having used this diligence, he ordered the legions in his camp to come and meet him, and those which were with him to take their turn of rest and go back to the camp. And the same day went to Larissa. At the losses, by the way, in Crastinus' fate. In that battle, no more than 200 privates were missing. But Caesar lost about 30 centurions, valiant officers, so he highlights once again the necessity of these leaders to have fought like a veritable champions, essentially for the mass of the troops. This is very important. Without them, the men could have not been led to victory through the enemy ranks. Crastinus, also of whom mention was made before, fighting most courageously, lost his life by the wound of a sword in the mouth. Nor was that false which he declared when marching to battle, for Caesar entertained the highest opinion of his behavior in that battle, and thought him highly deserving of his approbation. Of Pompey's army there fell about 15,000. But upwards of 24,000 were made prisoners. So this is a bit of an exaggeration, of course, but for even the cohorts which were stationed in the forts surrendered to Sulla. Several others took shelter in their neighboring states. 180 stands of colors and 9 eagles were brought to Caesar. Lucius Domitius, fleeing from the camp to the mountains, his strength being exhausted by fatigue, was killed by the horse. So, just by reading one Caesar's phrase on Pharsalus in Latin made me realize we really need to start a series about Indo-European theology through Caesar's writing. However, we also have to go on with this video talking about the main other classical sources that talked about the Battle of Pharsalus and trying to understand something better. Again, we treat them as, there's not much of a difference between primary and secondary. Of course, here Caesar is the source of exception in so many ways. But we have hell of names here: Appian, Plutarch, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio. So Appian, Civil Wars, Book 2. Right, he was dealing with them. He was, as you know, an Hellenic historian writing in the 2nd century AD. So, of course, we're fairly after this. After battle. Appian offers a narrative drawing from earlier sources. Obviously enough, again, we don't know too well which one the sources were. This is something, at least Caesar, you can say, well, he was there, he was the commander. But if you read, Polybius, if you read many other famous sources about the Roman army, we don't know exactly, because we know from the way they were writing, they were doing so from specific sources. Sometimes it could be literally people who had fought in this battles and so on, but we don't know that. There's no evidence whatsoever, unfortunately. So we're going to skip any other philological issue regarding this, and let's simply read Appian 64. Here again, because there is all a story before, there is the Rachium, there is the March to Thessaly, etc. In any case, we can read 64 or better 65. After Caesar had withdrawn, Pompey called a council of war, which Afranius advised that they should make as of their naval force, in which they were much superior, and being masters of the sea should have harassed Caesar. This is a bit too early, because it's too much strategical. Right. Let's start better from this 70. Since many writers differ as to Caesar's army, I shall follow the most credible Roman authorities, who give the most careful enumeration of the Italian soldiers as the backbone of the army, but do not make much account of the allied forces or record them exactly, regarding them as mere foreigners, and as contributing little to the issue of the day. The army then consisted of about 22,000 men. Of these, about 1,000 were cavalry. So this follows Caesar, of course. But Pompey had more than double that number, of whom about 7,000 were cavalry. Hence, here we get the still Caesar's figures. Some of the most trustworthy writers say that 70,000 Italian soldiers were engaged in this battle. Again, probably there were less. Like the same Appian says. Others give the smaller number 60,000. All right. Which actually well aligns with the numbers that we listed here of the legionaries, the only truth. Still, others grossly exaggerate and say, okay, well, 400,000. Of the world numbers, some say Pompey's forces were half as many, again, as Caesar's. Others that they were 2/3 of the total number engaged. So much that just a Greek could write the stuff. Just compared to Caesar, that is literally narrating a saga, right? He's actually describing a metaphysical unfolding. Like it's here the Greek starts calculating numbers. This is literally like cultural difference. So much doubt is there as to the exact truth. However, that maybe each of them placed his chief reliance on his Italian troops. You see, this is kind of obvious. Like we know that. Like only a Greek would wonder, because evidently somebody had said, but maybe he had auxiliaries. He didn't talk about us. This is more like an inter-Hellenic discourse of some sort. Of course, the Romans were fighting mostly with their Roman Italic forces, their Roman citizenry legionnaires. So it's irrelevant, right? So in the way of allied forces, Caesar had cavalry. So this is more interesting because, he talks about what Caesar doesn't talk too much. It says cavalry from both Cisalpine and Transalpine Gaul, besides some light-armed Greeks, consisting of Dolopians, Acarnanians, and Aetolians. Such were Caesar's allies. Pompey had a great number from all the eastern nations, part horse, part foot. From Greece he had Lacedaemonians, marshaled by their own kings, and others from Peloponnesus and Boeotians with them. Athenians marched in his aid also, although proclamation had been made that they, being consecrated to the Thesmophory, should do no harm to the army of either party. Nevertheless, they wished to share in the glory of the war, because this was a contest for the Roman leadership. Besides the Greeks, almost all the nations of the Levant sent aid to Pompey: Thracians, Hellespontines, Bithynians, Phrygians, Ionians, Lydians, Pamphylians, Pisidians, Paphlagonians, Cilicia, Syria, Phoenicia, the Hebrews, and their neighbors the Arabs, Cyprians, Herodians, Cretans, Lingers, and all the other islanders. Kings and princes were there leading their own troops. Deiotarus, the Tetrarch of Galatia, these were Celts, and Ariartes, king of Cappadocia. Taxiles commanded the Armenians from the hither side of the Euphrates. Those from the other side were led by Megabates, if you prefer, the lieutenant, Megabites, who could say, the lieutenant of King Artapatis. Some other small princes took part with Pompey in action. It was said that 60 ships from Egypt were contributed to him by the sovereigns of that country. Cleopatra and her brother was still a boy, but these did not take part in the battle, nor did any other naval force, but they remained idle at Corcyra. Pompey seems to have acted very foolishly in this respect, both in disregarding the fleet, in which he excelled so greatly that he could have deprived the enemy of all the supplies brought to them from abroad, and in risking a battle on land with men exulting in their recent labors and thirsting like tigers for blood. Beautiful expression for Caesar's legionaries. And exulting in their recent labors. Although he had been on his guard against, this is a light motive, of course it's influenced by Caesar, it's narrative that Appian was following, but in any case. Although he had been on his guard against them at Dyrrhachium, a certain spell seems to have come over him, most opportunely for Caesar, with the result that Pompey's army became light-headed to a degree, taking entire charge of its commander and rushing to action in a most manlike way. Such was the ordering of divine providence to usher in the universal imperial power of our own day. Each of the commanders assembled his soldiers and made an appeal to them. Pompey spoke as follows: "You, my fellow soldiers, are the leaders in this task rather than the led, for you urged on this engagement while I was still desirous of wearing Caesar out by hunger. Since therefore you are the marshals of the lists of battle, conduct yourself like those who are greatly superior in numbers. Despise the enemy as victors do the vanquished, as young men do the old, as fresh troops do those who are wearied with many toils. Fight like those who have the power and the means and the consciousness of a good cause. We are contending for liberty and country. On our side are the laws and honorable fame, and this great number of senators and knights against one man who is periodically seizing supreme power. Go forward, then, as you have desired to do, with good hope, keeping in your mind's eye the flight of the enemy at the Dyrrhachium and the great number of their standards that we captured in one day when we defeated them there." Right? The Dyrrhachium is also another great battle. We will talk about it. It's a bit more construed, right? But it's because there are field fortifications, etc. But it's quite beautiful. Such was Pompey's speech. Caesar addressed his men as follows: "My friends, we have already overcome our more formidable enemies and are about to encounter not hunger and want, but men. This day will decide everything. Remember what you promised me at the Dyrrhachium. Remember how you swore to each other in my presence that you would never leave the field except as conquerors. These men, fellow soldiers, are the same that we have come to meet from the Pillars of Hercules, the same men who gave us the slip from Italy. They are the same who sought to disband us without honors, without a triumph, without rewards, after the toils and struggles of 10 years, right after we had finished those great wars, and after innumerable victories, and after we had added 400 nations in Spain, Gaul, and Britain to our country's sway. I dismissed unharmed, hoping that we should obtain some justice from them. Recall all these facts to your minds today, and if you have any experience of me, recall also my care for you, my good faith, and the generosity of my gifts to you. Nor it is difficult for hardy and veteran soldiers to overcome new recruits who are without experience in war and who, moreover, like boys, spurn the rules of discipline and of obedience to their commander. I learned that he was afraid and unwilling to come to an engagement. His star has already passed his zenith. He has become slow and hesitating in all his acts, and no longer commands, but obeys the orders of others. I say these things of his Italian forces only. As for his allies, do not think about them, pay no attention to them, do not fight with them at all. They are Syrian, Phrygian, and Lydian slaves, always ready for flight or servitude. I know very well, and you will presently see, that Pompey himself will not entrust to them any place in the ranks of war. Give your attention to the Italians only, even though those allies come running around you like dogs trying to frighten you. When you have put the enemy to flight, let us spare the Italians as being our own kindred, but slaughter the allies in order to strike terror into the others. Before all else, I order that I may know that you are mindful of your promise to choose victory or death. Throw down the walls of your camp as you go out to battle and fill up the ditch, so that we may have no place or refuge if we do not conquer, and so that the enemy may see that we have no camp and know that we are compelled to encamp in theirs. Nevertheless, after he had thus spoken, Caesar detailed 2,000 of his oldest men to guard the tents. The rest, as they passed out, demolished their fortification in the profoundest silence and filled up the ditch with the debris. When Pompey saw this, although some of his friends thought that it was a preparation for flight, he knew that it was an exhibition of daring and groaned in spirit to think that they were now coming to grips with wild beasts, although they had on their side famine, the best tamer of wild beasts, but there was no drawing back now when things were balanced on the razor's edge. Wherefore, leaving 4,000 of his Italian troops to guard his camp, Pompey drew up the remainder between the city of Pharsalus and the river Enipeus, opposite the place where Caesar was marshalling his forces. Each of them ranged his Italians in front, divided into 3 lines with a moderate space between them, and placed his cavalry on the wings of each division. Again, Appian follows Caesar. And again, in the numbers of Pompey, you must take into account that, as we've seen here, thousands of troops had remained in Pharsalus, right? So, mathematical objections here are just on a part of a broader historiographical critique that cannot substantiate how many troops actually existed in an objective, precise sense on the battlefield, but it's mostly still, again, around the same numbers. Archers and slingers were mingled among all, thus were the Italian troops disposed, on which each commander placed his chief reliance. The allied forces were marshaled by themselves rather for show than for use. There was much jargon and confusion of tongues among Pompey's auxiliaries. Pompey stationed the Macedonians, Peloponnesians, Boeotians, and Athenians near the Italian legions, as he approved of their good order and quiet behavior. The rest, as Caesar had anticipated the order, to lie in wait by tribes outside the line of battle, and when the engagement should become close, to surround the enemy, to pursue, to do what damage they could, and to plunder Caesar's camp, which was without defenses. The center of Pompey's formation was commanded by his father-in-law Scipio, the left wing by Domitius, and the right by Lentulus. Afranius and Pompey guarded the camp. On Caesar's side, the commanders were Sulla, Antony, and Domitius. Caesar took his place in the 10th legion in the right wing, as was his custom. When the enemy saw this, they transferred to face that legion the best of their horse, in order to surround it, if they could, by their superiority of numbers. When Caesar perceived this movement, he placed 3,000 of his bravest foot soldiers in ambush and ordered them, when they should see the enemy trying to flank him, to rise, dart forward, and thrust their spears directly in the faces of the men, because, as they were fresh and inexperienced and still in the bloom of youth, they would not endure injury to their faces. Thus they led their plans against each other, and each commander passed through the ranks of his own troops, attending to what was needful, exhorting his men to courage, and giving them the watchword, which on Caesar's side was Venus Victrix, because also descendants of against Julia from both Mars and Venus, and on Pompey's Hercules the Invincible. So it's a more Hellenistic war cry. The Romans had the more traditional, I'd say the Romans, the Caesarians, forgive my personal bias, but still, of course. Now, when all was in readiness on both sides, they waited for some time in profound silence, hesitating, looking steadfastly at each other, each expecting the other to begin the battle. They were stricken with sorrow for the great host, for never before had such large Italian armies confronted the same danger together. They had pity for the valor of these men, the flower of both parties, especially because they saw Italians embattled against Italians. As the danger became nearer, the ambition that had inflamed and blinded them was extinguished, and gave place to fear. A reason purged the mad passion for glory, estimated the peril, and laid bare the cause of the war, showing how 2 men contending with each other for supremacy were throwing into the scale their own lives and fortunes. For defeat would mean the lowest degradation. There's a typo here, and those of so large a number of the noblest citizens. The leaders reflected also that they, who had lately been friends and relatives by marriage and had cooperated with each other in many ways to gain rank and power, had now drawn the sword for mutual slaughter, and were leading to the same impiety those serving under them. Men of the same city, of the same tribe, blood relations, and in some cases brothers against brothers. Obviously, this is the general rhetoric, of course, of the Roman Civil War. That, remember, watch that video about the Fortuna Caesaris that is explained on a theological basis why God's chosen people had started to fight against one another, spilling the same the blood of heroes like in the process. Like, even these circumstances were not wanting in this battle, because many unnatural things must happen when thousands of the same nation come together in the clash of arms. Reflecting on these things, each of them was seized with unavailing repentance, and since this day was to decide for each whether he should be the highest or the lowest of the human race, they hesitated to begin so critical a battle. It is said that both of them even wept. When they were waiting and looking to each other, the day was advancing. All the Italian troops stood motionless in their places, but when Pompey saw that these allied forces were falling into confusion by reason of the delay, he feared lest the disorder should spread from them before the beginning of the battle. So he sounded the signal first, and Caesar echoed it back. Straightway the trumpets, of which there were many distributed among the divisions of so great a host, aroused the soldiers with their inspiring blasts, and the standard-bearers and officers put themselves in motion and exhorted their men. They all advanced confidently to the encounter, but with stupor and the deepest silence, like men who had experience in many similar engagements. And now, as they came near together, there was first a discharge of arrows and stones. Then, as the cavalry were a little in advance of the infantry, they charged each other. Those of Pompey prevailed and began to outflank the 10th legion. Caesar then gave the signal to the cohorts in ambush, and these, starting up suddenly, advanced to meet the cavalry. Because if you've noticed, of course, the 10th legion was the one where Caesar was on the not on the right, on the right extreme of the battle line, right? Not the cohorts in ambush. We also don't know exactly where they were located, but you can see it. Now, I don't think I'm going to insert the battle map like before, because we've already seen it. We are rereading here a paraphrasing of Caesar enriched with some more sort of Hellenic sensitivity, let's put it in this way. And the 10th Legion, Caesar then gave the signal to the cohorts in ambush, and these, starting up, suddenly advanced to meet the cavalry, and with spears elevated aimed at the faces of the riders, who could not endure the enemy's savagery nor the blows on their mouths and eyes, but fled in disorder. Thereupon, Caesar's men, who had just now been afraid of being surrounded, fell upon the flank of Pompey's infantry, which was denuded of its cavalry supports. When Pompey learned this, he ordered his infantry not to advance farther, not to break the line of formation, and not to hurl the javelin, but to open their ranks, bring their spears to rest, and so ward off the onset of the enemy. Some persons praise this order of Pompey as the best in a case where one is attacked in a flank, but Caesar criticized it in his letters. He says that the blows are delivered with more force, and that the spirits of the men are raised by running, while those who stand still lose courage by reason of their immobility and become excellent targets for those charging against them. Besides, Caesar tells this before the entire outflanking thing had happened, right? So it's interesting that Appian sort of conjoins them, because, again, Caesar had that, literally he doesn't say that, there is another timing, and here it was mostly about the clash between infantries, not much what happened when you're outflanked, which is, as we've seen, a disaster to begin with. It matters a few how you meet the enemy in the front at that point. So he says it proved in this case, for the 10th Legion, with Caesar himself, surrounded Pompey's left wing, now deprived of cavalry, and assailed it with javelins in flank, where it stood immovable, until finally the assailants threw it into disorder, routed it, and this was the beginning of the victory. In the rest of the field, slaughter and wounding of all kinds were going on, but no cry came from the scene of carnage, no lamentation from the wounded or the dying, only sighs and groans from those who were falling honorably in their tracks. The allies who were looking at the battle as at a spectacle were astonished at the discipline of the combatants. So dumbfounded were they that they did not dare attack Caesar's tent, although they were guarded only by a few old men. Nor did they accomplish anything else, but stood in a kind of stupor. As Pompey's left wing began to give way, his men even still retired step by step, in imperfect order, but the allies, who had not been in the fight, fled with headlong speed, shouting, "We are vanquished!" dashed upon their own tents and fortifications as though they had been the enemy's, and pulled down and plundered whatever they could carry away in their flight. Then the rest of Pompey's Italian legions, perceiving the disaster to the left wing, retired slowly at first in good order and still resisting as well as they could. But when the enemy, flushed with victory, pressed upon them, they turned in flight. Thereupon Caesar, in order that they might not rally and that this might be the end of the whole war and not one battle merely, because the Iraqian had been in part like Pompey's mistake in that regard. He had basically won, but he didn't press further, like Vercingetorix Rix after Gergovia. That's where also Caesar's fortuna lays. With greater prudence than he had ever shown before, sent heralds everywhere among the ranks to order the victors to spare their own countrymen and to smite only the auxiliaries. The heralds drew near to the retreating enemy and told them to stand still and fear not. And this proclamation was passed from man to man. They halted, and the phrase "stand and fear not" began to be passed as a sort of watchword among Pompey's soldiers. For being Italians, they were clad in the same style as Caesar's men and spoke the same language. Accordingly, the latter passed by them and fell upon the auxiliaries, who were not able to resist, and made a very great slaughter among them. When Pompey saw the retreat of his men, became bereft of his senses and retired to a slow pace to his camp. When he reached his tent, he sat down speechless, resembling Ajax, the son of Telamon, who they say suffered in like manner in the midst of his enemies at Troy, being deprived of his senses by some god. Very few of the rest returned to the camp, for Caesar's proclamation caused them to remain unharmed, and as their enemies had passed beyond them, they dispersed in groups. As the day was declining, Caesar ran hither and thither among his troops and besought them to continue their exertions till they should capture Pompey's camp, telling them that if they allowed the enemy to rally, they would be victors for only a single day, whereas if they should take the enemy's camp, they would finish the war with this one blow. He stretched out his hands to them and took the lead in person, although they were weary in body. The words, an example of their commander, lightened their spirits. Their success so far and the hope of capturing the enemy's camp and the contents thereof excited them, for in the midst of hope and prosperity men feel fatigue least. So they fell upon the camp and assaulted it with the utmost disdain for the defenders. When Pompey learned this, he started up from his strange silence, exclaiming, "What, in our very camp?" Having spoken thus, he charged his clothing, mounted a horse, and fled with 4 friends, and did not draw rein until he reached Larissa early the next morning. So Caesar established himself in Pompey's camp, as he had promised to do when he was preparing for the battle, and ate Pompey's supper, and the whole army feasted at the enemy's expense. The losses of Italians on each side, for there was no report of the losses of auxiliaries, either because their multitude or because they were despised, I think especially the latter, were as follows. In Caesar's army, 30 centurions and 200 legionaries, or as some authorities have it, 1,200. On Pompey's side, 10 senators, among whom was Lucius Domitius, the same who had been sent to succeed Caesar himself in Gaul, and about 40 distinguished knights. Some exaggerating writers put the loss in the remainder of his forces at 25,000, but Asinius Pollio, who was one of Caesar's officers in this battle, records the number of dead Pompeians found as 6,000. Such was the result of the famous battle of Pharsalus. Caesar himself carries off the palm for the second place, common consent, and with him the 10th legion. The 3rd place is taken by the centurion Crastinus, whom Caesar asked at the beginning of the battle what result he anticipated, and who responded proudly, "We shall conquer, Caesar, and you will thank me either living or dead." The whole army testifies that he darted through the ranks like one past and did many brilliant deeds. When sought for, he was found among the dead, and Caesar bestowed military honors on his body and buried it, and erected so as a hero, like transfiguring to heaven, and erected a special tomb for him near the common burial place of the others. So this was Appian. Other source, critical source, is Plutarch. All right, Life of Caesar and Life of Pompey, and his famous parallel lives, were between the 1st and the 2nd century AD. And Plutarch gives biographical accounts, including details of Pharsalus based on earlier records. So there is an actual narrative of the Battle of Pharsalus, then some anecdotes, starting from 42, for the Life of Caesar. But when both armies entered the plain of Pharsalus and encamped there, Pompey's mind reverted again to its former reasoning, and besides, there befell him unlucky appearances and vision in his sleep. Right, this is very interesting. He dreamed, namely, that he saw himself in his theater, the famous theater of Pompey, applauded in Rome in Campus Martius, applauded by the Romans. And those about him, however, were so confident and so hopefully anticipated the victory that Domitius and Spinter and Scipio disputed earnestly with one another over Caesar's office of Pontifex Maximus. I mean, I talked about the concept of Pontifex, by the way, in the European sacred royalty, right? And so this is very, you see here already, like there is this overconfidence, this lack of respect for the sacred. And many sent agents to Rome to hire and take possession of houses suitable for praetors and consuls, assuming that they would immediately hold these offices after the war. And most of all were his cavalry impatient for the battle, since they had a splendid array of shining armor, well-fed horses, and handsome persons, and were in high spirits too on account of their numbers, which were 7,000 to Caesar's 1,000. Their numbers of the infantry also were unequal, since 45,000 were arrayed against 22,000. So here we're given more or less the same figures as before. Caesar called his soldiers together, and after telling that Corfinius was near with 2 legions for him, and that 15 cohorts beside under Calenus were stationed at Athens and Megara, asked them whether they wished to wait for these troops or to hazard the issue by themselves. Then the soldiers besought him with loud cries not to wait for the troops, but rather to contrive a maneuver to come to close quarters with the enemy as soon as possible. As was holding a lustration and reviewed of his forces and had sacrificed the first victim, the seer at once told him that within 3 days there would be a decisive battle with the enemy. And when Caesar asked him whether he also saw in the victims any favorable sign of the issue, "Thou thyself," said the seer, "canst better answer this question for thyself. For the gods indicate a great change and revolution to the present status to the opposite. Therefore, if thou thinkest thyself well off as matters stand, expect the worse fortune, if badly off the better." Moreover, one night before the battle, as Caesar was making the round of his sentries about midnight, a fiery torch was seen in the heavens, which seemed to be carried over his camp, blazing out brightly, and then to fall into Pompey's. And during the morning watch, it was noticed that there was actually a panic, confusion among the enemy. However, Caesar did not expect to fight on that day, but began to break camp for a march on Scotus. But just as the hands had been struck, his scouts rode up to him with tidings that the enemy were coming down into the plain for battle. At this he was overjoyed, and after the prayers and vows to the gods, drew up his legionaries into 3 divisions. Over the center he put Domitius Calvinus, while the wings Antony had one, and he himself the right, where he intended to fight with the 10th legion. But seeing that the enemy's cavalry were arraying themselves over against this point, and fearing their brilliant appearance and their numbers, he ordered 6 cohorts from the furthermost lines to come round to him unobserved, and stationed them behind his right wing, teaching them what they were to do when the enemy's horsemen attacked. Pompey had one of his wings himself, and Domitius the left, while Scipio, Pompey's father-in-law, commanded the center. But his horsemen all crowded to the left wing, intending to encircle the enemy's right and make a complete rout about the commander himself, for they thought that no legionary array, however deep, could resist them. But that when so many horsemen made an onset together, the enemy would be utterly broken and crushed. When both sides were about to sound the charge, Pompey ordered his legionaries to stand with arms at the ready and await in close array the onset of the enemy until they were within javelin cast. But Caesar says that here too Pompey made a mistake, not knowing that the initial clash with all the impetus of running adds force to the blows and fires the crowd. You see how both Appian and Plutarch decided to recover. Of course, they interdepended. Appian was influenced by this work as well, but they thought that this was an important aspect, which everything then conspires to fan, as Caesar himself was about to move his lines of legionaries and was already going forward into action. He saw first one of his centurions, a man experienced in war and faithful to him, encouraging his men and challenging them to vie with him in prowess. Him Caesar addressed by name and said, "Caius Crasinius." So here they also varied the name. "What are our hopes and how does our confidence stand?" Then Crassinus, stretching forth his right hand, said with a loud voice, "We shall win a glorious victory, O Caesar, and thou shalt praise me today, whether I am alive or dead." So saying, he plunged foremost into the enemy at full speed, carrying along with him the 120 soldiers under his command. This would be the equivalent of a maniple, interestingly enough, which actually was still there, right? The maniple, both tactically and organically, survived for a very long time. It wasn't ended by the Marian reforms. But after cutting his way through the first rank, and while he was forging onwards with great slaughter, he was beaten back by the thrust of a sword through his mouth, and the point of the sword actually came out at the back of his neck. So it is also a pretty graphic concept of what, legionary versus legionary combat looked like. When the infantry had thus clashed together in the center and were fighting, Pompey's cavalry rode proudly up from the wing and deployed their squadrons to envelop the enemy's right. And before they could attack, the cohorts ran out from where Caesar was posted, not hurling their javelins as usual, nor yet stabbing the thighs and legs of their enemies with them, but aiming them at their eyes and wounding their faces. This is also very interesting because they had been instructed to do this by Caesar, who expected that men little conversant with wars or wounds, but young and pluming themselves on their youthful beauty, would dread such wounds especially and would not stand their ground, fearing not only their present danger, but also their future disfigurement. And this was what actually came to pass, for they could not endure the upward thrust of the javelins, nor did they even venture to look the weapon in the face, but turned their heads away and covered them to spare up their faces. This is interesting because, again, we get different information about the fact that this combat could at some point allow to strike faces, thighs, legs, rather than, of course, like the torso that was protected by the scutum at large. All right, but it's the psychological aspect of this kind of combat that could be modulated by Caesar at Caesar's request, right? And evaluating the psyche of the enemy compared to the one of his own veterans, right? This is very, very fascinating. And finally, having thus thrown themselves into confusion, they turned and fled most shamefully, thereby ruining everything. For the conquerors of the horsemen at once encircled by the infantry fell upon their rear and began to cut them to pieces. When Pompey on the other wing saw his horsemen scattered in flight, he was no longer the same man, nor remembered that he was Pompey the Great, but more like one whom heaven has robbed of his wits than anything else. He went off without a word to his tent, sat down there and awaited what was to come until his forces were all routed and the enemy were assailing his ramparts and fighting with their defenders. This nervous breakdown is really important because it's not just very accurate in what it happens, but you should imagine it happening in the mind of a 1st century BC, a Roman warlord, right, that had stuck all his prestige on that kind of imperial grandeur and accomplishment, and when that was taken away from heaven, had failed in everything. So this is an incredibly conscientious and open-minded way of dealing with the world, with reality. Of course, by people who molded the same at their own will. Then he came to his senses, as it were, and with this one exclamation, as they say, "What, even to my quarters, took off his fighting and general dress, put on one suitable for a fugitive, and stole away." What his subsequent fortunes were, and how he delivered himself into the hands of the Egyptians and was murdered, he shall tell in his life. But Caesar, when he reached Pompey's ramparts and saw those of the enemy were already lying dead there, and those who were still falling, sent with a groan, "They would have it so. They brought me such a pass that if I, Caius Caesar, after waging successfully the greatest wars, had dismissed my forces, I should have been condemned in their courts." Asinius Paulius says that these words, which Caesar afterwards wrote down in Hellenic, were uttered by him in Latin at the time. He also says that most of the slain were servants who were killed at the taking of the camp, and that not more than 6,000 soldiers fell. Most of those who were taken alive Caesar incorporated in his legions, and to many men of prominence he granted immunity. One of these was Brutus, who afterwards slew him. Caesar was distressed, we are told, when Brutus was not to be found, but when he was brought to his presence safe and sound, was pleased beyond measure. There were many portents of the victory, but the most remarkable one recorded is that which was seen at Tralles. In that city's temple of victory there stood a statue of Caesar, and the ground around it was naturally firm and was paved with hard stone. Yet from this it is said that a palm tree shot up at the base of the statue. Moreover, at Patavium, Caius Cornelius, a man in repute as a seer, fellow citizen and acquaintance of Livy the historian, chanced that day to be sitting in the place of augury. And to begin with, according to Livy, he discerned the time of the battle and said to those present that even the event was in progress and the men were going to action. And when he looked again and observed the signs, he sprang up in rapture, crying, "Thou art victorious of Caesar." The bystanders, being amazed, he took the chaplet from his head, and declared with an oath that he would not put it on again until the event had borne witness to his heart. At any rate, Livy insists that it was so. So here it goes on, it doesn't add any other detail on the battle. Let's pass to two actually other anecdotes that I think are to be found. Well, not really on Pharsalus per se. It's named in the rest of the text, but not really in regarding this. Like Suetonius, this is, as you know, writing in the early. This is the life of Julius Caesar, writing in the early 2nd century AD. Suetonius includes brief references to the battle, focusing on Caesar's role. So there are scattered references in here of the battle. Here, for example, he reports what we just read. They would have it so, because when he looks at the enemies being massacred, even I, Gaius Caesar, after so many great deeds, should have been found guilty if I had not turned my army for help. Some think that habit had given him a love of power in that way. Okay, this is not really connected with Pharsalus. Not really much else. Like the Battle of Pharsalus, he cried out, this is also taken from a previous source, "Spare your fellow citizens," and afterwards allowed each of his men to save any of the men he pleased to opposed party. This is pretty much the only references. Finally, we have Cassius Dio, Roman History, Book 41, chapters 52-63. Simply read them again. Again, they're the same source, but you understand, of course, Caesar is the main source. So it was once more becoming powerful. Pompey did not pursue him. This is after Dyrrhachium, right? For he had withdrawn suddenly by night and had hastily crossed the Genusus River. However, he was of the opinion, that he had brought the war to an end. Consequently, he assumed the title of Imperator, though this was Pompey. Though he uttered no boastful words about it and did not even wind laurel about his faces, disliking to show such exultation over the downfall of citizens. From this same motive he neither sailed to Italy himself nor sent any others there, though he might easily have taken possession of it all. For with his fleet he was far superior, so it's always the same narratives, you understand, it's just a recrafting of the same. As he had 500 swift ships and could land at all points at the same time. Moreover, the sentiment of that country was not opposed to him in any case, and even if it had been even ever so hostile, the people were no match for him in a war. But he wished to be far from giving the impression that Italy was the stake for which he was fighting, and did not think he ought to cause any fear to the people who were then in Rome. Hence, remember, like the good family's father policy of Pompey. Hence, he made no attempt on Italy, nor even sent to the government any dispatch about his successes, but after this he set out against Caesar and came into Thessaly. As they lay opposite each other, the appearance of the camps bore indeed the semblance of war, but their arms were idle as in time of peace, as they considered the greatness of the danger and foresaw the obscurity, in uncertainty of the issue, and still felt some regard for their common ancestry and their kinship. They continued to delay. Meanwhile, they exchanged propositions looking toward friendship and appeared to some likely even to effect an empty reconciliation. The reason was that they were both reaching out after the supreme power and were influenced greatly by native ambition and greatly also by acquired rivalry, since men can least endure to be outdone by their equals and intimates. Hence, they were not willing to make any concessions to each other, since each felt that he might win, nor could they feel confident, if they did reach some agreement, that they would not be always striving to gain the upper hand, and would not fall to quarreling again over the supreme issue. In temper, they differed from each other to this extent that Pompey desired to be second to no man, and Caesar to be first of all, and the former was anxious to be honored. You understand the subtle difference of this. Was anxious to be honored by a willing people and to preside over to be loved by men who fully consent, whereas the latter cared not at all if he ruled over an unwilling people, issued orders to men who hated him, and bestowed the honors with his own hand upon himself. This also, like, it's a much later narrative, and it's we know that it wasn't exactly like this. It's a bit dramatized, but in any case, for both sides, by the way. The deeds, however, through which they hoped to accomplish all that they wished, were perforce common to both alike. For it was impossible for any one successfully to gain ends without fighting against his countrymen, leading foreigners against kindred, obtaining vast sums by unjust pillage, and killing unlawfully many of his dearest associates. Hence, even though they differed in their desires, yet in their acts by which they hoped to realize those desires, they were alike. Consequently, they would not yield to each other on any point, in spite of the many claims they put forward, and finally came to blows. The struggle proved a mighty one and unparalleled by any other. In the first place, the leaders themselves had the name of being the most skilled in all matters of warfare, and clearly the most distinguished not only of the Romans but also of all other men then living. They had been trained in arms from boyhood, had constantly been occupied with them, and performed deeds worthy of note, had been conspicuous for great valor and also for great fortune, and were therefore most worthy of commanding and most worthy of victory. As to their forces, Caesar had the largest and the most genuinely Roman portion of the state legions, and the most warlike men from the rest of Italy, from Spain and the wall of Gaul and the islands that he had conquered. Pompey had brought among many from the senatorial and the equestrian order, and from the regularly enrolled troops, and had gathered vast numbers from the subjects and allied peoples and kings. With the exception of Pharsalus and Orodes, for he tried to win over even the latter, although an enemy since the time he had killed the Crassi. All the rest who had ever been befriended at all by Pompey gave him money, and either sent or brought auxiliaries. Indeed, the Parthian had promised to be his ally if he should receive Syria, but as he did not get it, he let him no help. While Pompey then greatly excelled in numbers, Caesar's followers were their equals in strength. And so the advantages being even, they were an equal match for each other, and the risks they incurred were equal. Right? You understand how these sources perfectly understand the balancing of the strategic odds. As a result of these circumstances and the very cause and purpose of the war, a most notable struggle took place. For the city of Rome and its entire empire, even then great and mighty, lay before them as the prize, since it was so clear to all that it would be the slave of him who then conquered. When they reflected on this fact and furthermore thought of their former deeds, Pompey of Africa, Sertorius, Mithridates, Tigranes, and the sea, and Caesar of Gaul, Spain, the Rhine, and Britain, they were wrought up to the highest pitch of excitement, believing that those conquests too were at stake, and each being eager to acquire the other's glory. For the renown of the vanquished, far more than these other possessions, becomes the property of the victor, since the greater and more powerful the antagonist that a man overthrows, the greater is the height to which he himself is raised. Therefore, they delivered to their soldiers and also many exhortations, but very much alike on both sides, saying all that is fitting to be said on such an occasion with the reference to both the immediate results of the struggle and to the subsequent results. As they both came from the same state and were talking about the same matters and called each other tyrants and themselves liberators from tyranny, of the men they addressed, they had nothing different to say on either side, but stated that it would be a lot of one side to die, of the other to be saved, of the one side to be captives, of the other to enjoy the master's lot, to possess everything, or to be deprived of everything, to suffer or to inflict a most terrible fate. After addressing some such exhortations to the citizens and furthermore trying to inspire the subject and allied contingents with hopes of a better lot and fears of wars, they hurled at each other kinsmen sharers of the same tent, of the same table, of the same libations. Yet why should any one lament the fate of the others involved, when those very leaders who were all these things to each other, and had moreover shared many secret plans and many exploits of like character, who had once been joined by domestic ties and loved the same child, as one as a father, as the other as a grandfather, nevertheless fought. All the ties with which nature, by mingling their blood, had bound them together, they now, led by their insatiable lust of power, hasten to break, tear, and rend asunder. You understand how moralistic this narrative is. Because of them, Rome was being compelled to fight both in her own defense and against herself, so that even if victorious, she would be vanquished. Such was the struggle in which they joined. Yet they did not immediately come to close quarters, sprung from the same country and from the same heart, with almost identical weapons and similar formation. Each side shrank from beginning the battle, and shrank from slaying anyone. So there was great silence and dejection on both sides. No one went forward or moved at all. Well, this is, again, as we've seen, you understand that Cassius Dio's narrative here is over the line. It doesn't add up. It's more like a moralistic intent. But with heads bowed, they stood motionless as if devoid of life. Caesar and Pompey, therefore, fearing that if they remained quiet any longer, their animosity might become lessened, or they might even become reconciled, this is ridiculous, hurriedly commanded the trumpeters to give the signal and the men to raise the war cry in unison. Both orders were obeyed, but the combatants were so far from being imbued with courage that at the sound of the trumpeter's call, uttering the same notes, and at their own shout raised in the same language, they showed their sense of relationship and betrayed their kinship more than ever, and so fell to weeping and lamenting. But after a long time, when the allied troops began the battle, the rest also joined in, fairly beside themselves at what they were doing. Those who fought at long range were less sensible of the horrors, as they shot their arrows, hurled their javelins, discharged their slings without knowing whom they hit. But the heavy armed troops and the cavalry had a very hard time of it, as they were close to each other and could even talk a little back and forth. At one and the same moment, they would recognize those who confronted them and would wound them, would call them by name and would slaughter them, would recall the towns they had come from and would despoil them. So this is again the Italian Civil War. Such were the deeds both had done and suffered by the Romans and by the others from Italy who were with them on the campaign wherever they met each other. Many sent messages home through their various layers, but the subject force fought both zealously and relentlessly, showing great zeal, as once to win their own freedom, so now to secure the slavery of the Romans. This insistence on this. They wanted, since they were reduced to inferiority to them in all things, to have them as fellow slaves. Thus it was a very great battle and full of diverse incidents, partly for the reasons mentioned and partly on account of the numbers and the variety of the armaments. There were vast bodies of heavy armed soldiers, vast bodies of cavalry, in another group archers, and still others that were slingers, so that they occupied the whole plain and scattered over it. They fought often with each other, since they belonged to the same arms, but often with men of the other arms indiscriminately. The Pompeians surpassed in cavalry and archers, hence they would surround troops at a distance, employ sudden assaults, and retired after throwing their opponents into confusion. Then they would attack them again and again, turning now this side and now to that. The Caesarians, therefore, were on their guard against this, and by wheeling round always managed to face their assailants. And when they came to close quarters with them, would seize hold of both men and horses in the eagerness of the struggle, for light armed cavalry had been drawn up with their cavalry for this very purpose. And all this took place, as I said, not in one spot, but in many places at once, scattered all about, so that with some contending at a distance and others fighting at close quarters, this body smiting its opponents and that group being struck, one detachment fleeing and another pursuing, many infantry battles and many cavalry battles as well were to be seen. Meanwhile, many incredible things were taking place. One man, after routing another, would himself be turned to flight, and another who had avoided an opponent would in turn attack him. One soldier who had struck another would be wounded himself, and a second who had fallen would kill the enemy who stood over him. Many died without being wounded, and many half dead kept on slaying. Some were glad and sang paeans, while the others were distressed and uttered lamentations, so that all places were filled with shouts and groans. The majority were thrown into confusion by this fact, for what was said was unintelligible to them, because of the confusion of nations and languages, and alarmed them greatly. And those who could understand one another suffered a calamity many times worse. For in addition to their own misfortunes, they could hear and at the same time see those of their neighbors. At last, after they had carried on an evenly balanced struggle for a very long time, this is very rhetorical, but some things can adapt to the narrative. Remember what I said before regarding, for example, the clash between infantry. Right, that also is very important. It's not just the flanking maneuvers. There was a big fight in between. A very long time, and both sides alike had fallen or been wounded. Pompey, since the larger part of his army was Asiatic and untrained, was defeated, even as had been made clear to him before the action. For thunderbolts had fallen upon his camp, a fire had appeared in the air over Caesar's camp, and had then fallen upon his own. Bees had swarmed about his military standards, and many of the victims, after being led up close to the very altar, had run away. The bad omen. And so far did the effects of that contest extend to the rest of mankind, that on the very day of the battle collisions of armies and clash of arms occurred in many places. In Pergamon, a noise of drums and cymbals rose from the temple of Dionysus and spread throughout the city. In Tralles, a palm tree grew up in the temple of Victory, and the goddess herself turned about towards an image of Caesar that stood beside her. In Syria, 2 young men announced the result of the battle and vanished. And in Patavium, which now belongs to Italy, but was then still part of Gaul, some birds not only brought news of it, but even acted out of to some extent. For one, Gaius Cornelius drew from their actions accurate information of all that had taken place and narrated it to the bystanders. This would be incredibly fascinating, by the way, metaphors, but also actual matters of metaphysical fact that the ancients would have really expressed themselves through. And none of this is random. There's the Deus Absconditus, there is the birds bringing like the voice of the heaven. Naturally, the Statue of Victory speaks by itself. The Palm of Victory springing up in Tralles, we've seen also before. Like it all makes an incredible sense. It's also very interesting that, of course, there was already at this point a statue of Caesar in a temple of Victory, which is extraordinary. It tells you how these men were already seen in the time and what kind of world this really was. Definitely not a modern or secular one. These several things happened on that very same day, and though they were not unnaturally distrusted at the time, yet when the news of the actual facts was brought, they were marveled at. Of Pompey's followers who were not destroyed on the spot, some fled whithersoever they could, and others who were captured later on, those of them who were soldiers of the line enrolled in his legions, exhibiting no resentment. Of the senators and knights, however, he put to death all whom he had previously captured and spared, except some whom his friends begged off, for he allowed each friend on this occasion to save one man. The rest who had then for the first time fought against the release, remarking, quote, "Those have not wronged me who supported the cause of Pompey, their friend, without having received any benefit from me." The same attitude he adopted towards the princes and the peoples who had assisted Pompey. He pardoned them all, bearing in mind that he himself was acquainted with none or almost none of them, whereas from his arrival they had previously obtained many favors. Indeed, he praised these far more than he did those who, after receiving favors from Pompey, had deserted him in the midst of dangers. The former he could reasonably expect would be favorably disposed to him also, but as to the latter, no matter how anxious they seemed to please him in anything, he believed that inasmuch as they had betrayed their friend in this crisis, they would, on occasion, not spare him either. A proof of his feeling is that he spared Pharsalus the Thracian and Deiotarus the Galatian, who had been in the battle, and Tarcondemotus, who was ruler of a portion of Cilicia and had been of the greatest assistance to Pompey in the matter of ships. But what need is there to enumerate the rest who had sent auxiliaries, to whom also he granted pardon, merely exacting money from them? He did nothing else to them, and took from them nothing else, though many had received numerous large gifts from Pompey, some long ago and some just at the time. He did give a certain portion of Armenia that had belonged to Deiotarus to Ariobarzanes, king of Cappadocia, yet in this he did not injure Deiotarus at all, but rather conferred an additional favor upon him. For he did not curtail his territory, but after occupying all of Armenia previously occupied by Pharsalus, he bestowed one part of it upon Ariobarzanes and another part upon Deiotarus. This man then he treated in this wise. Pharsalus on his side made a plea that he had not assisted Pompey, and therefore, in view of his behavior, deserved to obtain pardon. But Caesar showed him no consideration, and furthermore reproached him for this very thing, that he had proved himself base and impious towards his benefactor. Importantly enough, such humanity and uprightness did he show throughout to all those who had fought against him. You see, this notion that, again, these subjects of Rome owed to even the enemies of Caesar the fact that they had been nurtured under Roman command, right? The Romans were truly the master race in this picture. At any rate, all the letters that were found filed away in Pompey's chests, which convinced any persons of good will towards the latter or ill will towards himself, he neither read nor had copied, but burned them immediately, in order not to be forced by what was in them to take several measures. This is very interesting. And for this reason, if no other, one ought to hate the man who plotted against him. It's a beautiful statement, actually. It says, I make this statement with a particular purpose, since Marcus Brutus Scipio, who afterwards killed Caesar, was not only captured by him, but also spared. So he did not really want to read, also because he likely knew, in any case, most of what was plotted against him. As we've seen, the Pompeians thought that Rome would have been back in their hands quite soon, right? Again. So this is very interesting overall. It's naturally a very interesting battle that illustrates a bit, like, as you understand here, look, more than else, some very interesting cultural aspects of the Roman Imperium and military culture in general. So everybody knows about the battle, right? But when you study like the accounts, you realize that even the maneuver on the flank, that's how he won, right? To make it simple, it's still actually considered by the same sources some kind of relatively secondary aspect, or at least it is the one that allows the victory. There is the complexity, as we've seen also, of the infantry charging the cavalry with the spirits of Caesar, etc. But still, there is a big deal in the clash between the Romans. There is the drama of the civil war. These people were of the same blood, and they recognized one another through the ranks. It was a tragedy of sort. Naturally, at the time they fought, this did not prevent them from slaughtering each other. Even though, again, in combat, not much later, in the sense that that happened too, but there was a broader project of pacification that Caesar, as you have understood, was carrying out for obviously recompacting, bringing to an end this carnage to begin with. So it's indeed an incredibly complex scenario that you can't simply reduce to just a tactical dimension, at least devoid of broader political, moral, cultural considerations. Nevertheless, it was really important to add this battle to the ranks of Schwerpunkt once, right? Recently, we have been dealing with lots of battles. We will have others soon, right? And over the years, they sort of came up less regularly, less frequently, at least for some reasons that I don't understand how they were sorted out by the machine at the end of the day, because that's what I always use to roll the dice figure. Sometimes there is an actual dice rolling, but it's more perfect than what AI can do in terms of random choice, because there is no such thing like a random thing especially like we can't philosophize about the dice rolling, but in those random calculators online. To simplify the thing, we made, this is the 66th battle that we cover on Schwerpunkt in some level of depth, right? And this is quite important, I would say, that we talk more about this stuff, that we look at the brutality of it all. It's easy, again, with classical sources, especially of this caliber, to simply read the narratives that, regardless of whether they're rhetorical or not in this case, especially Caesar's accounts are magnificent. Again, we must absolutely come back to read Latin in an incredibly serious way here, because literally, again, it's a saga illustrating traditional metaphysics. Nothing more, nothing less. Right? Caesar was really a traditional person as blip. And again, we have to continue with that. More than else, I'm also happy that we're covering more Roman history, because we really made a lot about Roman warfare. This is, I see here, the 122nd video, but it always feels like it's such a big topic that we haven't especially entered into the saga itself, right? Something we managed to discuss. But at the same time, like, looking a bit also at the campaigns, we never really talked extensively about the civil wars here, about the Punic Wars. There is so much, like, I'm really thinking of different stuff, such as starting, a campaign series on Spartacus Rebellion, But really, we must recover. We must talk much more about Roman warfare, especially all throughout true evidential political, strategical histories of campaigns, battles, and more. Because there's so much, it's impossible not to produce more. And this, in fact, probably I will expand also some branch in the cycle, as some of them are getting exhausted. We must really take some radical turns with this. Again, it's impossible to remain silent in front of Roman warfare. We must really do more and more. At the same time, it's really a pleasure to just to make this type of video, this type of videos. As we've seen, we have also some ever more pictures, which is something you would say, but we're not here. I know that some of you is actually here for the pictures, but in general, like you know that Schwerpunkt is primarily about analysis, but let's say the visual side of the story is important as well. I don't think we can simply deny that there is some great relevance even in showing, for example, like what a Roman legion in the 1st century BC really was. Fortunately, I have plenty of pictures, as you can see from here. Instead, I'm making a lot of manipular Polybian ones on my own through AI, but just for the polishing. Basically, I do the art and then I refine the shiny part with AI for the look. But here, at least about late Republican warfare, we have a lot of pictures, and this is, I mean, not so a lot actually. Like they're still pretty contained, but compared to, I don't know, medieval, modern stuff. But it's great that we have them. It's great that we can use them. Again, thank God there is Wikimedia Commons, because otherwise you wouldn't really know where to find pictures to begin with. So again, it's such a majestic battle. I wish I had already talked about this phase in Roman history, the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, which is also is important for many didactic reasons. Probably make some special again about other battles. I want to do something about Actium, for example. We have to talk more about Octavian, but there are some big instructive strategic calculations here. These are very good didactic examples in the history of warfare, and as such they should be studied, like all the considerations of Pompey chiefly, that had the initiative at some point to choose Asia over to Spain or Africa, for example. Abandoning Italy was not much of a problem, actually, but any other option than Asia was better. The best one would have been possibly Spain, but also Africa was not bad because they could control as we've seen, Pompey had the fleet, which Caesar didn't. So from Africa, you can't really grab Italy by the attributes, so to say. In Spain, as you know, as Caesar would have to struggle the hard way later on, Pompey had actually the best military. They had the true Pompey. Here, the sources said something different sometimes, but the true Pompeian veterans that were pretty tough son of Blippus were in Spain, right? And he wouldn't go over there, right? So in any case, we will see this. If anything, I would like to couple it with some more intense, sort of, again, manualistic introduction. Because we made, I don't know, we made a lot, for example, about the 2nd century BC, which is fine and good. It's a very fascinating century, very underrated one in many ways. I like it, but the 1st century BC is, again, it just happened. There is no specific reason. As I always say, what hasn't come before will come later. And so, again, I don't have much of an issue regarding that. If it wasn't for the fact that, again, here late Republican Rome I made 28 videos, so it's not even that few, right? But here it's actually, I see some are dabble. Why? Well, never mind. Can't correct. In fact, there are less at this point. But in fact, it's a bit too few. But we talk about Caesar a little bit more recently. We happen to talk about him on multiple occasions. So that at least I'm glad that some topics like this were already addressed, but we really need the nitty and gritty political picture behind this, and also just the same history of the war in general. All right, and it's a pity it happened like properly with Roman history. We made some beautiful videos about Rome, but it still lacks the compactness, right, that I would like my Roman history content to have. This is true also for any other content. I feel like I'm still beginning in many ways with Schwerpunkt. But again, everything proceeds also under specific time and energy constrictions. It's great that we made so many videos, and it's great that I see here, for example, in the last couple of days we've had substantial amount of views, of subscriptions. It's great, right? It feels like the audience is responding. Once again, you know that in May things were not too great, but the channel is actually expanding, and it's actually doing so with much greater ease at so many levels. Yeah, this is pretty much it. Then at some point we will surely again go much more on than this. I'm glad we surpassed the 2 hours for such an important battle like Pharsalus. It doesn't seem even possible to me that we actually talked about that. Again, the more time passes, the more I realize we need some more in-depth kind of description. Also here, for example, were quite interesting tactical details we addressed more or less, but what the sources themselves say is basically it, right? So other than highlighting them, you can think of some practical considerations, but as I explained to you, there is a lot religiously going on, right? And that's mostly what you have to think, especially when you read Caesar. What is he actually doing with that? People are completely severed from this kind of spiritual background from the Roman sources, but it's really necessary to understand. It really speaks volumes about how they actually thought, and how, by extension, also other peoples in Europe at the time did not write actually thought. So we will see this better in other videos, because it's basically what Schwerpunkt will also have to become about at some level at some point, because it's really crucial content, and I think that it's mostly what I'm heading towards, right? Very well. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.